What if someone told you to stop tapping your fingers when you're anxious or swaying to music when you're excited? Now, what if every time you did it, they made you sit on your hands, take away your favorite things, or reward you only when you stopped? For decades, ABA has done just that, treating stereotypies as behaviors to fix rather than natural ways of thinking, feeling, and coping. But here's the real question. Are we truly helping, or are we forcing people to suppress who they are? In today's episode, we're pulling back the curtain on the ethics of targeting stereotypies. Why do these behaviors happen? When does intervention support someone, and when does it cause harm? And most importantly, how can we create an approach that respects autonomy, self-regulation, and neurodiversity? Let's rethink what ethical, compassionate ABA really looks like. Welcome to Action Insights. Today, we'll be talking about the ethics of eliminating stereotypies and who really benefits. My name is Nikki Dionne.
I'm Amelia Dalphonse.
And just real quick before we get in to talking about stereotypies and ethics, we are going to offer an ethics CEU for this podcast. And we offer CEUs for most of our podcasts in general. So if you're interested in getting CEUs, there are going to be 3 code words throughout the podcast. So listen to the code words and write them down. At the end of the podcast, click on the link in the description. The CEUs are only $5. You'll have to enter the code words in order to get your certificate. And as a freebie, our first code word is stereotypy. Now, I can't always spell that without spell check, but don't worry because they're spelled out, multiple choice. But the first code word is stereotypy.
So I want to start by kind of thinking about a definition for stereotypies. Stereotypies are those behaviors that we often classify as having an automatic function. So they are self-reinforcing behaviors. A lot of times we'll think of like hand flapping or the shaking the knees or rocking or my hands moving really quickly because sometimes I do that. But there are those behaviors that there's vocal stereotypies, there's motor stereotypies, and they're often seen as disruptive behaviors. And that's what we want to talk a lot about today is the fact that stereotypies in general have often been classified as disruptive by the neuromajority. And in reality, a lot of people everybody engages in some level of stereotypic behavior. Clicking a pen or twirling your hair, those are all stereotypies.
When I talk about stereotypies, or if I'm training around, setting goals or talking to people about it, my question is always, how many of you sing in the car? Like when you're completely by yourself, do you sing in the car? And most people are like, sure, I sing in the car. And that is really what we're talking about. We're talking about behaviors that we engage in that in a behavioral world have and are automatically reinforcing in some way. But the underlying kind of internal or private events that are occurring are really strongly linked to the behaviors that fall under the umbrella of what we're calling stereotypies. So they are behaviors that help regulate when we have a sensory reaction, or if there's somebody's feeling overwhelmed with their senses in some way. It's a way to express emotions or regulate emotions. I know, like when I get nervous, like I'm more likely to fidget, like with my ring, which I don't have on right now. Oh no. So, we all do things that help us calm our nervous system. Again, those are private events. So sometimes it is challenging to figure out what the underlying, purpose or the automatic reinforcement part is. But most of those behaviors serve a purpose. And so I think today we're going to talk a little bit about how do we clarify, or how are we really looking at the difference between behaviors that are harmful versus harmless kind of stereotypies, right?
Right. And I mean, so I had a child who was engaging in chest pounding, really. He was hitting his chest with an open fist, an open hand, but he was hitting it with such force that he was leaving bruises. And as he got bigger, because he was only in kindergarten, but as he got bigger, the worry was that he would actually start to cause real damage, and he could have gotten strong enough to break his bones. That's an example of a harmful stereotypy. Some stereotypies include doing self-harm, banging your heads, and we have to understand kind of what regulatory purpose that behavior is serving. And I mean, sometimes, so for this kid, he engaged in it. We mentioned that sometimes it's when somebody is overstimulated, it's how they regulate, but this kid would do it when he was understimulated. So he needed to increase his sensory input in order to be able to do the things that were expected of him. So he would engage in that behavior. So we gave him other tools and other behaviors that he could engage in that would increase his sensory input, and that would serve the same purpose without him having to hurt himself. And you have to sometimes get creative and do a lot of trial and error to be able to do that successfully, because it's such a strong urge. I mean, think about trying to suppress some of the stereotypies that you engage in, because the reality is that it takes a lot of focus. And so many times we hear from schools that they want these behaviors to stop because they're disruptive to the class, but just trying to stop that behavior is so disruptive to the individual.
Right. And I think it's so good. Our last podcast was on pathologizing behavior, and this kind of links
directly into
to that to that podcast. And I think one place that I usually like to kind of think about starting is when we're thinking about stereotypies. And honestly, like sometimes I start to not even enjoy the word because I feel like it tends to classify, like put a group of behaviors and classify it in a way that is not helpful.
Yeah.
And so, we think about self-regulatory behaviors, right? Could you, like, just even sometimes language shifts are so interesting. We're using the term stereotypies today because if you talk to other BCBAs, like, this is the language that we use. And Amy and I talk a lot about, the field being kind of at a crossroads right now, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in the field of ABA, a lot of advocacy against the field of ABA. And we really are at a place where some shifting needs to happen across the board in order to, keep our field moving forward. In many ways, other fields have conversation for a different time. However, sometimes thinking about just even shifting language. So, if we're talking about self-regulatory behaviors, it starts to help us think about things in a very different way. And so, we think back to all of the older like research or kind of texts that we have in ABA, where stereotypies really were labeled as problem behaviors, any
Right.
stereotypy. And if you look at historical context, sometimes it really is looking at behavior that's outside what's expected as a socially acceptable behavior. And it automatically kind of gets put into a place where it's, kind of quote unquote labeled problem behavior, versus thinking about it from a more, human-centered kind of trauma-informed practice place, that we all engage in these behaviors to help regulate. And when do those behaviors that we're using to help regulate become challenging? And it's less about the behavior and more about teaching the skills of regulation, right?
Yes. And what's interesting is I just had a conversation yesterday with one of my supervisees. She's actually, she lives in another country. In her culture, stereotypies are just not accepted. It's a very different kind of culture than what we're experiencing in the United States. So she presented a treatment plan yesterday. The only goal was it was a behavior plan. She presented it. The only goal was to reduce stereotypies. And this kid had a lot of vocal stereotypies. So it was really hard for me to shift to making that an acceptable goal. And we talked a lot about why he's engaging in the behaviors, because I asked her the question, when does he not engage in the behaviors? And she said that he engages in the behaviors most when he's alone, or when he has nothing else to do, or when he's in social situations. And So when he doesn't do it is actually during DTT types of structured learning. So when he's challenged, when he's thinking. So in a lot of ways, he does it because he's bored. And when he doesn't know what else to do, like in a social situation, he doesn't know what to do in those situations. And that's when his stereotypies go up. So she's thinking that she needs to run a very structured behavior reduction kind of program, but I shifted it to be a lot more about skill development. So how do we, and we don't need to address when he's alone by himself and that's his method of entertainment. But if we were to focus on that social piece and teach him some social skills and teach him some scripts, and she was talking about using a replacement behavior of reading from a book to change the behavior. And she got a lot of her stuff from research, a lot of her ideas. And yes, that would be effective, but it doesn't teach him a skill. It stops the stereotypies because he's vocally saying something different. But if you give him questions that he could ask, he could read from cue cards. Sure, he's not necessarily ready to remember them given his profile, but he could, if he can read from a book, he could read from a cue card, and it could be a question that he could ask of his peers, and that would be a more appropriate way to address stereotypies. But it's so interesting to think about, like, what skills are the kids missing that they're using those stereotypies as a tool to overcome. And sometimes stereotypies are just the way that the child is managing the environment. And I think that those are fine. But a lot of times they actually reveal skill deficits if you dig into it.
Yeah, and from a, if we're thinking about it from a self-regulation, right, and a private event, emotional experience that someone's having, and when they can't communicate that to us effectively, we are guessing, and we are guessing what we might be teaching. But from a mental health perspective, living in my mental health world, a lot of times these behaviors are self-regulatory. If somebody's experiencing something aversive, usually anxiety, boredom can be aversive, and engaging in the behaviors helps decrease the anxiety. And so when I think about teaching skills, part of it is, how do I create opportunities, whether it's managing the environment, teaching a specific skill, supporting caregivers or other people in the environment, to recognize when things start to, the intensity or frequency starts to increase. And when we put all of these things in place, it does naturally help to teach those skills and decrease the stereotypies. But as an adult, this is where I always live in. I fidget, I bounce, I sing in the car to myself. I talk out loud all the time because that is something I don't realize I'm doing it sometimes. There's a really funny story of, I just have to take a little side note here, where I was in the grocery store and I literally thought I was having a conversation inside my head, but I do talk to myself outside a lot, just to help process things. And I was like, do I need rice? I think I have rice. Should I buy the rice? No, I think I have rice at home. Like, I literally think this conversation is happening in my head. And this very sweet lady came up and said, put her hand on my shoulder, and she said, dear, just buy the rice. And I was like, oh, okay. And it was this very natural kind of interaction. And I share it because I think it's hilarious. And what would it have been like, even as an adult, if that lady had come up and had a very negative reaction to a behavior I was engaging in? And I start to think about when we have things that are happening, and again, with the best of intentions, we come up and we're like, we're going to stop stereotypies. Just, we're going to reduce them or eliminate them. And we're not thinking about the skill that we can teach, and we're not thinking about how to manage the environment differently. Again, the private events and the likelihood of the long-term impact of that, just kind of being thoughtful of how we're looking at those things, and really kind of thinking about, is the behavior, and we've said this, right, truly problematic, or is the social context that we're in something that's not accepting of the behavior that we're observing?
Yeah. And that happens so much so that a lot of times people who engage in what's considered too high of a rate of stereotypies, they're actually removed from a lot of the social context. Yeah. And they can't be in a public library because they're not able to be quiet, or they're removed from the schools, or and it's just not necessarily seen as something that is normal. And so that brings up me to my next code word. Our next code word is inclusion. If we start to normalize the stereotypic behavior as being something that is a self-regulatory skill, and make that just kind of accepted, then we would be able to include everyone in all of the different contexts. So that second code word is inclusion.
I think back to when I was in school, and I am a fidgeter. I'm the person whose leg is going, right? And it happens when I'm anxious, but it happens when I'm bored. And most of the time at this point, even in like high school to now, I don't even realize I'm doing it half the time. So, kind of thinking about what's happening internally, private events that I could express out. But I used to have the bars on the chairs, I'd shake my leg. And it was disruptive to the person who was sitting in the chair in front of me. And so the intervention was that I needed to stop doing it. And the challenging outcome about that is that over time, I've become very aware of my self in space, and I'm very, very anxious sometimes about what my impact of my movements are doing to other people. And from an ethical perspective, right? So this is just my experience. It's not everyone's experience. And I am not autistic. I am diagnosed with ADHD, but I'm not autistic. So not one thing is true for everyone. But if I think about broadening that out, and oftentimes I was asked to leave the classroom, I was asked to take a break. And so I was removed from the space that I was in. I was allowed to come back. So I also think about kids who are removed and not allowed to come back.
Right.
But what is the middle ground? So from an ethical perspective, for that situation, there's two choices: sit still or fidget and leave the classroom. So we eliminate the behavior, and then I experience a lot of aversive feelings and experiences internally. So ethically, now we're kind of thinking about what is the middle ground, right? And this is where we run into things where we have needs from caregivers, maybe needs from a school. We have a person who is our client sitting in front of us, regardless of their age, who may or may not be able to vocally tell us what they want to work on. And now we're in a place from an ethical perspective that we need to meet the social validity and needs of our stakeholders, our caregivers, our client, right? Positive interventions. But what's the middle ground? And I always think about, like, have you seen those the rubber bands that go around the chairs now that you put on? Yeah. If I'd had a rubber band for my chair, I could have stayed in the classroom and fidgeted.
Yes.
And may not have some lifelong kind of impact from the restrictive, right, or kind of punishment-based interventions that occurred. And so we start to think as BCBAs, when we have self-regulatory behaviors, I'm totally coining that, by the way, self-regulatory behaviors. When we have self-regulatory behaviors, how are we, kind of navigating all those pieces that kind of come in?
Yeah. Well, and to make things a little bit more challenging, a lot of times it is the other stakeholders that are pushing us, and teachers and parents. And I've had a lot of parents talk about it, that they want the flapping to stop, or they want the different stereotypic behaviors to stop. And the like, how do you have that conversation with parents? Like, I hear you, I understand why it's a disruptive behavior, but it's not something I'm ethically willing to target. And for me, it is not a behavior that I'm willing to target directly for reduction. I'm happy to look at I'm happy to look at stereotypic behavior as a clue to skill deficits. So yes, it's a lot of times self-regulatory, and it's how they manage the input from the environment. But a lot of times, like I said in my other example, it represents a skill deficit. And so they might feel more anxious because they're missing important skills, for example. So it's dual purpose. They're regulating their emotions, but the emotions are coming out because of a skill deficit. And so how do you share all of that information with a parent and still feel like you're meeting their needs as well? I had a 8-year-old that I was graduating from services, and mom was like, no, he can't graduate from services because he's still flapping. Well, we haven't seen any challenging behavior in 6 months. He was great. I mean, he had made so much progress in the couple of years that I knew him, and he was communicating effectively, and he was happy to go and do all of the things. But mom was resistant to letting go of ABA services because he was still engaging in the stereotypies. But his stereotypies weren't disruptive at school. The school wasn't complaining about it. Mom was embarrassed by them. So he would engage in hand flapping when he was excited about something. It wasn't loud. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't hitting anything. He wasn't hurting anyone. But mom was embarrassed by it because it signaled that there was something different. And so I really took a lot of time with her to educate her about stereotypies. And there are some pretty good videos out there from autistic adults explaining their feelings about stereotypies. And so I shared some of those videos with her. I'll link them up in the description so that you can take a look at some of those as well, or use them as resources when you're trying to explain it. Sometimes it helps to have a different perspective, even if a family truly believes you and values your thoughts and opinions. Sometimes just having an outside perspective is beneficial, especially if it's somebody who is actually autistic, because I am not. So parents might not value my opinion on the matter as much as they would somebody who's autistic.
It's so much more validating sometimes for some people, right? Because I come in as a professional and I'm like, I have all this information and here's why I'm thinking this, you know, and here's how it would look. And, the caregiver at that time is really like, wanting something to happen, and having those videos, I think is really amazing to keep in or put into perspective what it is like living as an autistic individual and experiences with things like that. And I think it really can help families start to understand like neurodivergent behavior in a different way, versus seeing it as problematic or something, to worry about what other people are thinking or feeling embarrassed about. It starts to see it as more of an expression of, right, an individual's experience. And I do agree. I always appreciate Amy. This is where we talk ABA all the time and go back and forth. That you're right. Like when anxiety is occurring, right? I'm just jumping back to kind of the skill deficit. Like it's important to think about like, why is that happening?
Yeah.
Like, what is it about the environment? What is it for this individual who maybe doesn't have a skill set that's needed to help, manage the situation that they're in or communicate effectively or whatever it might be. And so it is important to think of most stereotypies are serving a dual purpose, right? They are regulatory, and they're most likely is something that we can teach as BCBAs or providers in ABA, or even, mental health therapists, if any mental health therapists are listening, that there are things that we can teach people to help them learn ways, or help them manage the environment differently, so that the aversive private event isn't so intense that they are engaging in high rates of those behaviors.
And so the example that I used yesterday to help my supervisee understand why I was saying the things that I did. I was very careful because I didn't want to push our societal beliefs and the shift onto her culture, but I did want her to understand why I didn't feel super comfortable with her targeting this behavior. And I said, imagine if I told you had to get on a plane, fly to a brand new city, and present on an ABA topic in front of a large group of people. Now think about how you would feel. And if I didn't give you a way to get out of it, you have to do this in order to meet your certification criteria. You have to do it. There's no way around it. What would you do? And she would feel very uncomfortable, very anxious. And I said, well, but you have a lot of tools to handle that. You might talk to yourself and say, well, it's okay. I can do this. I've got it. I've flown on a plane before. I can do it. I've talked to other people before. I can do it. Or you might ask for help. All right, I'm not sure what to say in front of all of these people. Can you help me create an outline for my presentation? Or can you help me handle some part of this presentation? Or you might also say, hey, I'm really uncomfortable doing this. I don't want to do it. Can you give me something else? And they can ask for a way to get out of that uncomfortable situation, the feeling of anxiety. But the kids that we're working with don't have any of those tools in their toolbox. So they engage in high rates of stereotypy when they're feeling anxious because they don't have another way to get out of that feeling or escape that feeling. So they need those regulatory skills. And so that's kind of the method that I use to help people who are a little bit resistant to accepting stereotypies, or who are just looking to reduce them and not look at the bigger picture. And I really think it's important to kind of look at stereotypies are like all behavior, they're communicating to us. They're communicating a need to us. They need to move. They need more input. They need less input. There's something that's going on with that individual. They don't have the skills to handle the situation. What other supports can we offer to them rather than trying to just reduce a behavior?
Such a good self-reflective practice too, right? As you're saying it out loud, thinking about, this is through supervision. And, I have talked to some BCBAs who don't always have access to supervision or don't have, the peer support and, are kind of sitting in these places. And I'm a big fan of reflection, especially when we're hitting into ethics and, ethical scenarios and things like that. And so really thinking about, as the person I am, or, knowing what I know about behavior and communication, what would happen if I were in the same situation? What are the skills that I'm using to help, eliminate the aversive experience that is occurring? And can I apply this out to the individuals that I'm supporting? The other piece too is just, as you were talking, I was thinking a little bit about kind of the problem behavior and pathologizing it. Now I'm just like stuck in our last podcast, but there are times in life where it is developmentally appropriate that somebody at a certain age doesn't have the skill, and we would be teaching it anyway, right? We would be teaching it to somebody who maybe isn't in services, and really kind of paying attention to how we're approaching those conversations and situations. I think that example is such a lovely one to use when we're thinking about how we're looking at stereotypies.
Yeah. So I like to look at stereotypies as a signal and not as something to fix. They're signaling to me that they have a need. And I think that we need to listen to that and allow them to meet their needs, but then to look a little bit deeper, because they experience the world in a way that is different than I do, And
it gives such a good opportunity to really start to think about like self-advocacy and autonomy and neurodiversity and how all of those things intersect into the work that we're doing. And our third code word is neurodiversity. So our third code word is neurodiversity. And, I think we really picked it because we are weaving through everything that, we have to start to think about things from a neurodiversity affirming approach. And that really looks at autonomy and building skills and understanding like behavior and what private events are, telling us. And I think when we're talking about stereotypies in general, it's such an important piece to kind of consider, to make sure that we're learning and integrating into our practice and our service.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Our next episode is going to be on social validity, and we're going to look at whose social validity really matters. I'm really excited to talk about that one. I think it's going to be really important. And we will see you in the next episode.
Thanks for joining us at Action Insights.